Call to order the March 21st, 2023 meeting of the Salem Planning Commission. Welcome, everybody. Shelby, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Augustine is absent. Commissioner Ekus?
Here.
Want me to do it again?
Commissioner Ekus?
Here.
Commissioner Fott?
Here.
Commissioner Gopal is absent. President Griggs?
Here.
Commissioner Heller?
Here.
Commissioner Levin?
Here.
Commissioner Slater?
Here.
And Commissioner Vieira Rendell.
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you. I would like to rearrange the agenda just slightly to remove item 6.2 from tonight's agenda and move it to the April 4th agenda unless there's any concern about that.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Ekus?
could we move it to the, well, let me ask you first, I intended to have some discussion.
Yeah.
And actually intended to move at the time to postpone until the second meeting in April instead of the first meeting in April. So
I would be normally just super happy about that because that gives us a little bit more time, but my understanding is, and I think Lisa is going to talk about it, the April 18th sign code amendment is going to be moved out to May, and I don't believe there's anything else scheduled for that night.
well, that's kind of part of my reason for making, for why I would have made the motion. So I'm wondering where is the appropriate time on the agenda where I can discuss what would have been the motion to adopt this amendment.
Would that be under good order? I want to do that in a different spot.
Because if I would, well, I don't know where to just, I'm trying to put this motion on changing the idea of changing the bylaws into a certain context. And for me, that context means having, my wish was to, my argument was that we should postpone it until after we have certain discussions about our advisory role and about the opportunities we have to do that. I think whether or not we use the April 17th meeting or not, I mean, if we cancel because there's no agenda, it kind of fits into the items of discussion that I was having, so.
Is there a reason why April 4th wouldn't work?
Well, I prefer to have more time. I believe there are discussions we need to have before we take it up. And I'm not sure that April 4th, since it's the next meeting, I'm not sure that that provides the.
Then possibly another alternative to give you enough time would be to schedule it in May, one of the May hearings.
Yeah, I didn't do
Is
that
that
because I'm
too
afraid
much
I
time?
might miss one of those meetings.
Well, it's up to you. You can meet on April, second meeting in April. That could be the only agenda item. I'm not saying we can't meet. So like that.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because I'm not sure where to have the discussion that I would have intended to have had there been a motion.
And I want you to have that discussion. So
So I'm not sure where in this meeting to do that, but I'd like to do that before we make a decision to put it on a particular date.
So you don't want to schedule it until we schedule that conversation?
I would prefer that, yeah. One way to approach it is to bring it up and then make a motion to table it to a specific date, which is actually what you're kind of suggesting.
Right.
I just,
Okay, so April 18th, would that be okay?
that would be fine with me. I think there's more time, but that's my preference, you know, but there are other people may want to do it sooner. I just don't feel like there's a big rush to get it to the council.
Mhm.
And I think there's things that we should discuss about our advisory role and how we do that and how we organize that and the opportunities that having a meeting when there's nothing else on the agenda opportunity provides us to have discussions about some things that we might do advisory role on.
And I don't have an issue with that at all. I do know that staff's always been pretty darn good on making room on an existing night that we are going to meet on a case to include other topics for consideration. So I have never yet been in a situation where somebody has expressed an interest in, let's hear more about, the sign code and them not having accommodations.
Yes, I understand that. I guess it kind of gets into my concern here is that there's a couple of times when we've gone months without having a meeting.
Right.
And that was a violation of the bylaw. I'm not.
It's actually the code.
I'm in the code, yeah. I'm not so concerned about that as I am the discussion we need to have about the advisory role we play and the opportunities to address issues and opportunities we have to set priorities for what issues we want to play an advisory role on.
That almost
And
sounds
how
like.
that's organized, and my concern without having the discussion amongst us is that having meeting, those times when we don't have an agenda that comes from the planning or the land use process are perfect opportunities to spend time on those issues. For example, I know today we've got the renewables. It's one of those. So we have a process, I know, where individuals can say we want to do this. But if we end up doing it only on the times where there are other agenda items, it kind of could cram the opportunity we have to get into some issues.
Okay.
And I kind of wanted to have a discussion about that before we decided whether or not it's not a position that we shouldn't have a a code change.
Right, yeah.
It's not that, it's that before we do that, there's a
Right.
discussion I think that's important for us to have. And I was just trying to give us
Right.
a couple of, some time to have that.
It almost sounds like a work session opportunity on the 18th to just have nothing else on the agenda, including that motion, to allow us time to have that discussion on
That would be.
what our role is. And so I would look to you and maybe Commissioner Slater to come up with, how you want that conversation to look like. Maybe we can talk before the meeting, because I think y'all have some ideas that would be good to share with.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Okay.
It's just, like I said, my concern is not whether or not we actually go forward with the code change, but that we have the opportunity to have a discussion about the advisory role and how to organize that
Right.
before we take up
So would that
code
be,
change.
okay, Lisa? Good.
So might a motion be, I move to amend the agenda and remove 6.2 and reschedule it for April
No, we're gonna do this work session first.
18th, but that's gonna be on the same night, right? Are you saying?
I don't think so. I think you wanted to have just a discussion first, maybe?
Okay.
Is that what you
Yeah,
were, I don't
I
want
think
to
it
put
would
words
be
in your
good.
mouth.
I don't see any, yes, I think it would be good to have the work session and then we could schedule it for a later.
In May, maybe. So just for a
time,
date.
because
in
I
the
don't
future.
think that
Okay, for a
doesn't
date in the
seem there's
future.
a
Yeah.
immediacy
Yeah.
to getting the code changed right away.
So perhaps Commissioner Levin's gonna make a motion to amend the agenda to remove 6.2 and reschedule it
To
at a
date.
later date and to direct staff to schedule a work session on the Planning Commission advisory role for April 18th.
You could just say so moved.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Heller. I'm just really good. Yeah, no. Discussion on the motion before we, Commissioner Slater?
Did you actually want to move that or something else?
Yes, a motion. Yeah, that motion.
I am just fine with moving that motion,
Okay.
as it was so eloquently worded by Mrs. Anderson Olivia.
You look like the road runner that just got run over.
Or thrown under one of the. Discussion on the motion. I think I think Commissioner Ekus really shared pretty good insight on why he would like that to happen, and it's a good conversation for us to have. Any further comments on that motion? If not, Shelby, will you please call the roll and signify by saying aye if you're in favor of the motion, nay if you're opposed.
Commissioner Ekis,
Aye.
Commissioner Vaught,
Aye.
President Griggs,
Aye.
Commissioner Heller,
Aye.
Commissioner Levin,
Aye.
Commissioner Slater,
Aye.
and Commissioner Vieira Brindle.
Aye.
Thank you, motion passes. Public comment. Should you see if Britt wants to talk now? Or-
He's at the end for.
Okay. Consent calendar, Commissioner Fott, do you have a motion?
Yes, I do. I move to approve the minutes from the planning commission meeting on February 28th, 2023.
Do I have a second?
Second by Levin.
Second by Levin. Discussion on the motion? Shelby, will you please call the roll, signify by saying aye if you're in favor of the motion, nay if you're opposed.
Commissioner Ekis,
Aye.
Commissioner Vaught,
Aye.
President Griggs,
Aye.
Commissioner Heller,
Abstain, I didn't review the tape.
Thank you.
Commissioner Levin,
Aye.
Commissioner Slater,
Aye.
and Commissioner Vieira Brindle.
Aye.
Motion passed with one abstention. We don't have any resolutions nor action items under 4.3. We have no public hearings. Moving on to 6.1, the energy study on options during renewable options during development. And I'm not sure if you're hooking them in for us. Shelby, yes, she's working on it. As a note, this is information as you saw on your agenda. It's not an action item.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can. Would you mind stating your name and address for the record, please?
Certainly, Rob Delmar, and I'm a senior policy analyst with Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm coming to you from Bend, Oregon.
Oh, lucky.
And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I often travel over the mountains to go to Salem, but it didn't work out for me this week. So thanks for accommodating the Zoom presentation. And also thanks to Commissioner Slater for bringing me to the meeting and getting this queued up, and to Shelby for making the technology work, at least so far. And I would like to share my screen to share a few slides. These are slides from a presentation that I made to a Senate Energy Committee shortly after the small scale community-based energy project study was completed. And it's just, I think it's about 6 slides. And so we can move through them pretty quickly and then hopefully move into more of a discussion or, Q&A if there's any questions. There's one piece of work regarding small scale renewable energy projects. But if you'd like to broaden the discussion beyond just what's in the study, that would be okay too. But I think perhaps the study is a good way to kick this off. So I'm going to attempt to share the screen. My screen certainly got a different look about it. Are you all seeing a presentation?
We're seeing the entire PowerPoint application, not like presenter mode. There we go.
All righty. Yeah, so the small scale community-based study was completed last fall. And like I said, I'll go through these slides and then we can have a discussion if there are some questions kind of about broader small scale renewable energy development. Study came out of House Bill 2021, which directed Oregon Department of Energy to convene a working group and cover barriers to project development, potential benefits of small scale projects, access and ownership opportunities, potential rate impacts, and also potential legislation that could hopefully address some of the barriers. And this is our representation on the work group. I won't go through this whole list. I know this is being recorded if anyone is interested in seeing who all was on there, but we had a lot of work group members. We had voices from every position within kind of the small scale discussion, including community group representatives, industry representatives from the solar, wind, and hydro industry. We had utility representatives, folks who were interested in evaluating rate impacts and making sure that the rate impacts are not too great. That is, that these things don't cost an exorbitant amount. So I'll move on. We had 4 workshops, and we focused basically on the areas that the statutory language directed us to look at, and that was ownership and access, opportunities and barriers, benefits, costs, and rate impacts. And finally, we had a wrap-up meeting to tie it all together. And one thing we learned was that one, we brought in guest speakers to bring kind of some real life examples from actual projects. And we learned that that was very valuable for the workshop members to hear from folks who have actually been developing these projects at a small scale. And the other thing we learned was in that workshop for when it came to possible recommendations, when we have such a diverse work group, we had a really hard time getting a consensus on items. And so in some ways, it was very valuable in that we had very diverse viewpoints and a lot of ideas that came out of the study. But we also, it was a bit of a detriment not being able to bring everybody together for definitive recommendations. And I think that's the nature of a study that is essentially designed to have many, many stakeholders involved. So you get a lot of great ideas, but maybe not consensus on all of those ideas. Here were some of the key findings. And we kind of broke it up into opportunities that exist for these small scale community-based projects, and then also some of the barriers. And some of the opportunities of note were the opportunity to address some equity issues and have projects that bring local benefits to communities, and not necessarily directly to utilities or project developers. One of the really good ones that we kind of teased out of the work group was efficient land use and the ability of the local community to identify brownfield sites, other sites within the community that are likely to get community support for project development. There is a lot of NIMBYism where people don't want to see them, they don't want them in their backyards. And if you work at the local level, you can identify the correct site that works for community members for developing some of these projects. Another big opportunity was improving local energy resilience. If you're developing renewable energy, if you add energy storage, most typically in the form of batteries, you also have the ability to have emergency backup power systems. And that resilience component brings a lot of value that you don't see in the large scale developer driven projects. We've seen a lot of projects around Oregon, including, I mean, Salem has been a leader in this with the Salem Smart Power Center. And I know there's a project with PGE to look at expanding that into a microgrid. These types of benefits that enable communities to continue to operate in the event of a prolonged power outage were one of the great opportunities for development. Increased local economic value, and that is the not only during construction when you have these projects, bringing essentially trade and commerce to the community, but once it's up and running, they can bring cost savings to publicly owned facilities by the benefit of the on-site generation of electricity. We found that there's really opportunities in every community, but some communities face more barriers, and this really gets to the point that we saw that a lot of small communities just don't have the capacity to envision a project and get it over the finish line. There's a lot of administrative burden to getting these projects going, including grant applications, vetting contractors, permitting. Not every community, especially when you get to very small communities that may have just a couple of staff representing the municipality, it's more of a barrier for them. And some of those specific barriers are relating to financing and insurance for these projects, regulatory hurdles like the siting and the permitting, and that local capacity and knowledge. In the absence of hard recommendations, we came up with these guiding principles, and this is what we found that all of the stakeholders could agree on. And was that these small scale projects can assist in meeting some of the state energy goals. I think it's important to note that the state energy goals, it's just as likely to meet them with large scale projects. They're based on essentially getting carbon emissions out of the electricity generation sector in Oregon. And it doesn't matter how large a project is, they all contribute to those goals. But if you are able to develop projects with less local resistance, there's some value there. Equitable outcomes, again, bringing value and benefits to these smaller communities. Maintaining affordable energy and rates for all Oregonians, that was an important component throughout the discussions. And a lot of the projects that have been going on in recent years, especially solar projects and wind projects, are now coming in competitive or even cheaper than traditional fossil fuel generation. And just recently in Idaho, there was a solar project that was developed that is going to be selling its energy to Idaho Power at a rate that was lower than what they were paying for coal power. So these projects really have, at the large scale, reached parity or even lower cost than gas and coal. But at the small scale, there's still a financial hurdle where you don't get those economies of scale. And the equitable distribution of costs and benefits. Project transparency, we found that it's these projects that are developed at the community level have much more transparency than when a developer from out of state comes in and develops 1,200 acres out. And we just found that with the perspectives of so many stakeholders, that you get a lot of differing ideas, and that doesn't always lead to consensus, but it does give you a good canvas of what all the different concerns and opportunities are. By citing these projects within Oregon at the small community scale, we're supporting economic development. We heard a really nice story about a small wind project that was developed beside some of the larger wind projects, Forge, and able to have a kind of a symbiotic relationship where several small projects together create an industry of these facilities. So there really is an ongoing economic fit for these community projects, and sometimes they leverage larger projects nearby, but not always. And then again, these unique contributions of small scale projects, this goes back to those same benefits that we just talked about, the energy resilience, the more targeted footprint, local ownership for local economic benefit. And in some cases, it's not only identifying the right piece of land, but also identifying a renewable energy resource that may not be known to a broader group of developers outside of the community. And in some cases, this could be a hydro resource for the municipal water supply, or it could be a biomass resource coming off the landfill. There's a lot of local knowledge around potential renewable energy resources that may not get the eye of larger developers. But I will stop sharing my screen and see if there are any.
Thank you, Rob. That was a great report, actually. I read every bit of it. So lovely. So noted, baby. So let's open it up for discussions, either questions for Rob, discussion amongst ourselves, questions of Lisa, and I'll take the first person, Commissioner Ekus.
Rob, I wonder how much reliance generally are you putting on the grant programs?
Yeah, good. That's a good question.
For both resilience and for the community solar projects.
For the community solar projects, I will say that I'm not an expert on those projects, that they're being administered by the Public Utility Commission and the Energy Trust. I can say that those projects have had such significant financial barriers that we've seen very few actually get developed. And that is with a rate that is, those projects will be reimbursed at a rate that equals the retail rate of electricity, which is approximately 3 times the rate that a large project would get for the generation. So we recognize that there's a financial barrier in community solar that is so far in Oregon been a difficult thing to
Thank you. I think Commissioner Ekus has a follow-up.
Yeah, a couple of them. How many applications for community solar did you get, or were they did they find out about the financial difficulties during the application process and therefore not proceed, or did they apply and then discover that it's not going to be financially going to work?
That's a good question. And again, our department is not administering the program. However, the last time I looked, they had over 40 applications. And I believe that they had something like 3 projects that were actually either online or very shortly going to be brought online. So my mind, the jury's out, and what I really want to see is data around the cost of those projects compared to a project of similar size that the community solar program, because the community solar program has a lot of administrative costs associated with attracting subscribers to the project, managing a bill credit process with the utility. The initial pass through that, all of that administrative burden, I think, has really taken a toll on some of those projects. But again, I'm just not close to those projects because it's not something I work on.
I understand that, Rob, and I'm sorry to keep asking you questions about the thing that you're not really involved in, but you're the only one here who might be able to answer. One of the things I wondered about is the degree to which those applications involved cooperation, a high level of cooperation and partnership with the actual utility serving the area.
My understanding is that those projects will have, I don't know if you would call it cooperation, but certainly coordination with the utility. And that's been one of the hurdles, is getting what they call an interconnection agreement. And so that, like permitting, is a prolonged and administratively burdensome process. It proved to be even more so for these community solar projects, where they had to carve out a new category of these qualifying facilities and work out some of the details. So in many cases, the utilities have been very cooperative, but within that framework, there's been a lot of administrative burdens. You know, out.
Just an observation, you seem to be cutting out in your sound.
Maybe I'll try shutting off my video. Sometimes that.
Yeah, that might help. Yeah. Other comments or questions for Lisa, Commissioner Heller?
Rob, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. My question is more procedural. How can the planning commission help with these projects, meeting these goals? Do you envision any role for us?
That's a good question, and there are some programs, and I will bring up the Community Renewable Energy Grant Program that Odo runs, where I work, known as the CREP. In fact, Salem has already been a successful applicant with PGE for one of those projects. But I think that when you can get a municipal entity of a planning commission looking at renewable energy projects, you can start unlocking some of those things that we identified in the study, like potential sites that might be appropriate for development, sites where maybe there was an old industrial, an old industrial development that maybe is no longer there, and so it's served with an electrical service and is ready to go for something like a solar project. And the other thing is just understanding the grant programs that are out there and working with community members to get grant applications flowing. And this relates to the first question, which the second part of that question was, how reliant are these projects on the grants? And we find that at the small scale, they are still reliant on grants, and especially when you bring in that energy resilience component, because batteries are still very expensive. And one thing that I noticed when I was reviewing the community solar projects, when I looked at it probably maybe 4 months ago, 0% of those projects had any energy storage, which means that when the grid goes down, they are not able to provide power to the local community. And so we haven't found that community solar is addressing the resilience component that well yet. Now they have time to get that going, and the technologies are coming along. But that's really an important one with our grant program, seeing if you can tie a project to, there's a project in Eugene where a rooftop solar facility on a school is tied to a municipal water well and a battery storage system. And if the power goes out for 2 weeks, the solar on the roof charges the batteries, and the batteries run a well pump, and you have the ability to bring potable water to the community members. And those types of benefits are something that you all could think about as you work through some planning, not only the renewable energy and storage part, but where is it most appropriate to site one of these? What are the most vulnerable communities within Salem where a project like that might bring the maximum benefit? So, just keeping your eye open for opportunities, I think, is a great thing to get out of planning commissions.
Thank you, Rob. Other questions? Commissioner Slater?
Thank you, and thank you, Rob, for joining us tonight. I do have a couple questions. One of the resources that I see in Salem is rooftops and empty parking lots. We have a lot of rooftops. I spent some time just looking at rooftop areas, which is a very exciting thing to do late in the evening, and found that just like in the McGillcrest area, there are 28 acres of roofs just in that one space. Now, of course, not every piece of roof is going to be useful for solar, but when I looked at the chart on our page is 18, it takes about 6 acres to generate a megawatt of solar energy. So even if 50% of that space were used, just McGillcrest alone could generate 2 megawatts of electricity for the city of Salem. And I know in that case, actually one of the facilities going in there is a commercial battery storage facility, which is kind of interesting. So there seems to be a market now for commercial electrical storage. So one of the questions I have in this is, if I owned a building in the McGillcrest that had a 2-acre roof, and I wanted to put a solar array on there, that solar array would not get to the size of what we're talking about in this conversation. Is that correct? It doesn't. Is community scale solar? Is it 1 megawatt and up, and anything below that isn't part of this conversation?
No, there's an upper band, and that's 20 megawatts defined in the statute. But on the small scale, you could go down to the hundreds of kilowatt range, and rooftops are a really prime opportunity. One, you don't see them, and so you're developing an area that has no local opposition from an aesthetic standpoint, but it's also not disturbing any farmland or the place where I used to run my dog or any of those types of sites. A second advantage to rooftop solar is that most of the time you're interconnecting those projects on the customer's side of the utility meter. And those projects get net metered, offset local loads. You can do that up to 2 megawatts, a net metered project, unless it's part of Salem electric territory, in which case the net metering limit is only 25 kilowatts. But in PGE territory, you can net meter 2 megawatts, and the interconnection is much simpler because you're essentially tying it into an electric service panel at an industrial site, or perhaps at a transformer, rather than on the utility side where some additional gear might be required. And the other thing that we saw as a little side benefit that might come out in the future to rooftop development is when you're looking at the commercial trucking industry. If you want to see where the box trucks are and the transport industry in a city, you look for the big warehouse rooftops. And as we go into electrification of transportation, that's going to be an area where we're trying to serve charging stations with new significant electrical loads. And so solar on rooftops is going to be a perfect match for potential transportation loads in the future.
Lisa, would you like to talk a little bit about rooftop commercial solar?
I don't know that I have a lot to say about it. Generally, we allow it. We don't have any standards that would prohibit it. A few of our zones, we require you to shield any rooftop equipment so you can't see it from the ground, from a certain distance in a few of our zones. My only really experience with a solar project, the school district, as part of their bond, they added a lot of solar panels in a field behind one of their schools. And it was just a building permit because we don't we just check setbacks and height, and then whatever they need from the building division. And we got so many complaints when they started building it. And the neighbors were very mad that they didn't get a comment, that it didn't go out for notice, that it was gonna, you know, ruin their living experience because the sun was gonna bounce off the panels and there were so many of them. And that they used to walk their dog, you know, it's a field at the school, it's part of the school, but they used to walk their dogs there. They called the city council, they emailed the city council complaining. The neighbors were actually lived in the county, so they started calling their county commissioners. And I mean, just like so many phone calls to the planning division about this building permit we approved. And then I started telling the staff to tell them, well, the school district has their own elected officials, so you can go. I mean, like, what do you want me to? And we talked to the school district staff, and they had set aside a certain percentage of the bond for renewables, and they had made the decision to concentrate that in some larger projects instead of doing smaller projects at each school for various reasons. And this was one of the schools that was then getting a big kind of field of solar panels, which they still felt like was a good decision for the school district, but it got built in the last summer. But I think there was also complaints to the school board about it. So it is interesting because it's, generally people want it, but then it's like, why are you doing that in the field behind my house? The only other thing I wanted to say, because Rob mentioned the Salem project and Commissioner Egas asked me, and I was like, I know I read about it, I had to Google it. So the city of Salem is doing a microgrid project in partnership with PGE over by in Southeast Salem as part of our new public works building, and we got $1 million grant from Department of Energy, renewable energy grant program to do that. It is a resilience project because it says that although it's connected to the grid, it can store energy during emergencies. It said it will be able to supply our new public works building, 6 apartment buildings, 34 homes, 4 government buildings, and 1 business. That's what we calculated. So that's underway right now.
So do you see a time maybe that we can use a carrot as an incentive for some of these commercial developments to consider rooftops? Because it just seems like an idea that people can get their heads around pretty easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we have a climate action plan that's calling for this, and so far the city hasn't, we don't have any money, right, to put towards it, which I think goes back to your question about grants and funding. And Commissioner Slater is being appointed to the Climate Action Committee as a planning commission representative. Will be the only non-city councilor on the committee. So I think that would be an opportunity for the city to talk about if they want to start putting money as an incentive. I know there's been some state bills, like requiring apartments to put in electric vehicle charging and doing other things. So there are, I think right now we're required to make sure large apartment complexes have the conduit, but they don't have to put in the chargers. And so there are certain things. So the city, the city could start making these requirements versus, trying to incentivize it. I think from the zoning perspective, we don't really have any prohibition on doing it. And I know you sent out that article, and I think we shared it with the whole commission about, was it France, where like all the parking lots have to be covered? Right. Yeah, and as part of the climate friendly and equitable communities rules for our parking lots, we have to make some changes. And so parking lots over a certain size will have to include either a certain amount of tree canopy coverage or solar panels going forward. So we'll be working on that amendment later this year to bring forward. And there's an option that the city could allow people to not install the solar and instead pay into a fund, and then we could create a grant program to give to people that want to do solar. We're exploring that because we don't currently have staff that would run that grant program, but we do run other grant programs. So we're trying to talk to everybody at the city that runs a grant program and be like, do you want to do this? And would you want to run this grant program for us? Yeah. Right, it's not really, the planning division can't really do it. So we're looking at what that could be, and we plan to gather information on how that could work and bring it to the Climate Action Committee for recommendation before we would put it in a code amendment, which would come through Planning Commission. So.
And it would be great, I don't know if you, I'll continue just a second, when we've had other representatives off of Planning Commission serving on special groups, they generally report back to us, like once a month, which would be great if you could do that. You'll be wonderful at that. Commissioner Slider, you got a comment?
I have a couple couple more questions for Rob. if I may.
Go ahead.
I don't know which page it is on now, but I saw someplace that the state was setting a goal that the utilities, investor-owned utilities, had to purchase 15% of their energy from community-based renewable sources. Is that correct, Rob?
There is a carve out for small scale projects, and I believe that right now it's actually 8% with a
8%.
bill proposing to take it to 10%. Although I could be mixed up, it might already be 10%.
Okay, so at some point here, or maybe there is today, there is an actual market for community renewable energy. Is that right? So there's someone that actually has to buy a certain percentage of this product?
Correct. Yep. The utilities will have to demonstrate that they're getting some percentage, 8 or 10 or whatever, wherever they land, from these small scale projects. Now, that bill defines small scale as 20 megawatts and less.
Or less?
And so, yeah, I mean, 20 megawatts is 120 acres, or it's not necessarily what you think of as a small project, but it's not 150 megawatts, which is what some of the larger ones are. So
what I'm trying to understand, I mean, again, I think that what Salem has, we don't have 5 acres that we would want to put, or 6 acres that I think we would want to put a solar facility on. We want a different kind of building on that. But we do have all these rooftops and parking lots. And so I can't imagine we're going to put in, a 20 megawatt facility, but, someone could come along and say, I want to rent the rooftops of your buildings in Gilchrist and cobble together a 1 megawatt or a 2 megawatt system. And that seems to me where Salem could go in addressing some of this. And so I guess my question was, if someone were to take up that opportunity, then they actually have someone that has to purchase, their utilities have to purchase some of that product.
correct. Yeah. And if they were designed strictly as projects that sell electricity to the utilities, then you could get them to qualify under this small scale category, and there presumably will be a premium for that energy once those 8% or 10% requirements kick in. I think it's in 2030. Now, again, if that same project were connected on the customer side of a meter and they were able to use it all on site, they're probably going to get somewhere around 8 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour for the generation of that project, because it's going to offset their local utility bill. If it was designed to sell directly to the utility, it's probably more like 4 cents plus some adder because it's small scale and we have yet to know what that market is. But the financial benefit is still probably higher to put a rooftop system on the customer side of the meter and offset the local load. Unless it's just very small loads on the site. And some warehouses are like that. They have a little bit of lighting load and they can get more solar than they have load. And then you could sell it and presumably get a premium for it.
So in my 2 acre McGilchrist warehouse that I now own, I mean, right now it would be in my financial interest to put solar on there behind the meter. I could then defray my existing costs that I could sell. And not only could I sell, but they would have to buy the surplus energy from my 2 acre system. Is that right?
Well, if it's net metered, and that would be several hundred kilowatts of solar, that would be a significant system. If it's net metered, you're able to roll a surplus of energy forward to future months. And so summer surplus can cover winter months when there's less solar. However, for a net metered project, at the end of a year of billing, and the solar year ends in March, all of that energy that is surplus at that point actually gets donated to PGE's low income assistance program and is not reimbursed by the utility.
So you
for
either
net-
get, go ahead.
No, I think you understand it. I think you.
Use it or lose it.
Right, so your choice is net metering and you offset your costs, or you sell it. You don't get to do both. Okay.
Yeah, you don't do both. Although if it's Salem Electric, you do get to sell the surplus at the end of each month, but that's at Salem Electric's avoided cost. And that's probably closer to 2.5 or 3 cents. And so it's really hard to see a project pencil at that very low avoided cost.
Did you have a follow-up question?
I don't think I do. I think that was all very helpful.
Then I'll move to Commissioner Ekus.
Thank you. A couple of things. I think we may need to distinguish between community solar project and small scale. As community solar is a particularly defined as opposed to the small scale. Second, I really think that the opportunities for solar involve two things in my mind. One is a high degree of partnership and working with the utility in trying to either develop the grants or identify and actually come to fruition possibilities for solar. So I think it really requires a high degree of partnership with the utility. The second thing is, because of that and because of the bureaucracies, and I know from the resiliency project and from early efforts to try and get a focus on a community solar project and reading the grant applications, that's a lot of bureaucracy. The grant application is pretty overwhelming. And I think it's going to be important, and I believe the council is going in this direction, or at least the budget committee is. I think it's really important that you have a staff person whose job it is to implement the climate action plan. Sorry, you're picking up my voice and Siri's searching for some action plans.
Searching for a staff person.
Yeah, it's like I call Upwork or whatever it is. So I think that's gonna be really important.
Yeah.
I mean, the council's in the process of, as I understand it, with the task force, setting priorities and picking out the most practical strategies. The reality is the most practical strategies are those ones that generally they will involve working with the utility in order to implement. But having a staff person, I believe, is really critical. Someone who can identify this and work through that, identify projects and help work through the bureaucracy and use the utility. I mean, if it's in the utility's interest, you can get the utility to write the grant proposal, but it really works. It really needs someone who is not distracted by other duties, and it needs someone who can focus on those issues to do it. So that I think there are opportunities in solar. I think it's a good thing for us to continue to explore and to find out the things that the city's already doing, to learn what other cities might have done, and to identify some of the opportunities. And then maybe we can have a two-way street through Michael with the council task force and the planning commission. But I think this is one of those areas where we should try and figure out the best way to exercise our advisory capacity as well, and utilize that to gather information and explore different options.
Good point. Commissioner Slater.
I have one more question for Rob. but
Sure.
I can wait if other.
I think I see your hand is over once.
So Rob, given some of the financing challenges that people have right now and the administrative burdens that people are facing to install some of these projects, do you have any experience of municipalities taking on a leadership role in leading an effort like this? So if Salem were to say, oh, we're in the middle of our resiliency plan and we decided that we really need to have 5 megawatts locally produced and stored. And we want to take the lead on that and develop that. Is that something that another city has done?
There have been some projects that have certainly had a strong municipal component, including many of the ones that are being funded in our community renewable energy grant program, where Salem is already participating, because you actually have to be a public body just to apply for that one. But two that come to mind, one is Milwaukee. And I don't know how much Clackamas County is involved, but Milwaukee has a similar vision for developing rooftop solar on a vast amount of warehouse space. I'm not sure how far they've gotten along that path, but it's certainly been something that's been discussed. And then another one is the Public Safety Center in Beaverton, or no, maybe it's in Hillsborough. No, I think it's Beaverton Public Safety Center. This is a municipal building that has solar and storage, and it houses a lot of the emergency response capabilities for the community. And so having the battery backup and the ongoing solar recharge of the batteries. Most of these facilities are fitted with a diesel generator, which is great. You can serve a lot more load with a diesel generator than you can with a little bit of rooftop solar. But in the event of, a seismic, emergency or something like that, the state's liquid fuels are likely going to be really hard to distribute. And so having a truly resilient recharge on that battery is something that's driving some of these. So, if Salem really took the reins and did something at the municipal level, I think you would likely kind of be leading the charge. But you might look into what Milwaukee has been talking about for their rooftop plan.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Commissioner Slater. Other questions for Rob before let him off the hook? Commissioner Fox.
Thanks. It's actually not a question. It's more of a musing that we're talking a lot about solar specifically as one of the renewable energies. But what if this was essentially treated more in a resiliency manner as it relates to getting these projects permitted? Is there some way we can incentivize, maybe there's an offset cost or something that similar to if you have like SDC credits, for example, if you are doing a demolition of a project and then coming back in with a remodel, is there a way that we can kind of bank renewable and resilient strategies at the design side that can then offset on the construction side, so that we can really start encouraging more development that uses those strategies from the beginning, rather than I think solar on rooftops is a fantastic idea, depending on the existing structure and what kind of solar you're implementing, and there are a variety of factors that come into play. And I think having those conversations as early in the design process as you can is really where the value is. And if, as an architect, if we can, be able to call the city and find out what those paths are that we can use as an opportunity, that, conversation that we can have with our clients to encourage that approach, I think there would be a lot more interest maybe in pursuing those. Because at the end of the day, as much as I would love to have all of my clients very happily charge forward into
No pun intended. That was no pun, right? No pun intended on the charge?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe as an example of a more challenging approach, but it is seeing results. There's a city in California that actually requires LEED certified, LEED silver buildings, all commercial buildings. And which is fine as a prescriptive path, but the actual certification being required does create, I think, some financial barriers that also may prevent people who have, less ability to enact that approach. But if we can do it, as I said, in some way of offsetting, in some way, I think that would be encouraging.
Good point. Any other questions for Rob or for Lisa? Thank you, Rob, for joining us tonight. Great information, and I really appreciate your time, and most likely Commissioner Slater will be back in touch with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I know that Commissioner Slater and Shelby both have my contact information. Feel free to reach out at any time if there's additional questions.
Okay. Thank you. Sure, Commissioner.
Another comment or observation, which may be wrong. Lisa can correct me, but Salem has done the resiliency with the Public Works program. But my understanding of that is it came about in large part, it's just by coincidental circumstance, in that PGE was doing some resiliency work in a particular location that happened to be close to the Public Works Department. And I bring that up because it's something that happened by circumstance. It was a great opportunity and it proceeded, but things aren't going to be that easy. Those circumstances aren't always going to be there and as obvious as they were for that. So while it's a great project and it worked out great, I think it's important to recognize that it was just sort of something that came together by coincidental circumstances and not a really necessarily planned way ahead.
Yeah, good observation. Any other comments before we move on in the agenda?
I would be interested in hearing Commissioner Levine's thoughts in terms of just, if you have any thoughts on where the market is or some of the commercial building owners, if they've been thinking about this, or you any awareness of what might be on their minds.
I can give some input. This goes back to 2008, 2009, but I have had clients put solar on industrial properties. And there's some logistical problems between utility companies and the tenant paying for electricity. And so if it's a building that you occupy for your own business, it's very easy to then put solar on because you're recognizing that. If you're talking about a building owner who is renting out their building, which a lot of those buildings, let me go, Chris, are rented by tenants, how to, as the owner of the building who invested in that solar, get compensated for the electricity that's generated is not a very easy thing. And at least full transparency, PGE did not make it easy themselves. And so the conversation between tenant and landlord actually became somewhat contentious. And if it wasn't for the federal dollars, and as well as, which was mostly tax incentives, as well as the I believe it was a grant from Oregon Department of Energy that was sponsored at that time, the value in the payback on the system wouldn't have been there. And so the system paid for itself by the incentives and the grants, which luckily this particular property owner had some tax liabilities carrying forward that they were able to leverage and benefit from those. But otherwise, this system would not have penciled. And to date, the income from it was such a problem with the tenant that it had been connected to, that when the contract ended and the property owner could disconnect that solar, they went and took it away from the tenants that it was feeding, and they gave it to a nonprofit organization that occupies space in the building, because that was the cleanest, simplest way to get some kind of income. Again, they're taking it as a charitable donation, but that tenant is willing to share their PGE bill, which has to be recorded with the building owner's CPA to show what that monthly donation value is. So the bookkeeping, the logistics, the whole process, to do it on the private side of the meter just needs to be vetted more thoroughly for how something like that would work. On a different scenario, because a lot of the examples that you made were the McGillcrest area, they're to pivot to something more central like downtown. Buildings that are traditionally office buildings, you'll see a full service rent structure, which includes the utility bills. In those instances, landlords that rent office buildings on a full service basis could very well benefit from it, and very easily benefit from it, because they're the ones that simply pay the electric bill. I happen to own a building just half a block from here, and I have multiple tenants. We have a large flat roof. We have looked at the feasibility of what would that do as far as reducing what is effectively $1,000 a month electric bill for that building. And unless the Department of Energy brings back their grant program, just paying for this system for me as a very small investor would be too great. I would have to take out debt to put that system in, to have something substantial enough of size that it would generate basically reducing the electrical billing in total, which is theoretically possible on that building. And then just to note, a building that I rebuilt on Capitol and Jefferson Streets in 2009. We engineered the trusses for that building to hold solar. It has a shed roof that is south facing with no tree exposure. We put conduit in for solar to be wired into the building. We marketed the building as with solar calculation from a provider that went with it. And in, I don't know, 14 years of owning the building, I've never once had a tenant take up the opportunity to engage in a solar project, even though I had numbers that showed that if we put it on the building, it would effectively net zero every month. So it's interesting that I did the work to provide the system and the capacity, and all we had to do was put the inverters and the panels on the roof, and nobody's taken up. People would rather spend money on a major interior remodel for $150,000 than put a $70,000 solar system on the roof. So it's very interesting kind of where the market's at, where we're seeing in the real estate industry, the demand or the push for it. There's just a couple blocks south of here, adjacent from my building, there's a multi-tenant office building that is rented full service, and they put solar on in that, I think, 2008, 2009 vintage, where they were getting roughly 40 to 50% of it back as grant money from Oregon Department of Energy. And I think from the time that we saw solar panels go on roofs, that was the most notable time frame. So if programs like that came back at a state level, we'd probably see more owners be willing to do it. The idea of renting rooftops was something that we saw a lot of people starting to try to work numbers on in that 2006, 7, 8 time period. And the program of doing the net metering didn't allow the volume of income that was necessary for that business model to work, where somebody could go rent 2 acres between different roofs on different properties, and then the combination of power through those different properties and different ownerships. Again, the utility companies wouldn't aggregate that together as if it was one individual selling directly to the utility. So there's a variety of different things that play. I don't know if anything that I've said is necessarily gives a concrete direction or comfort as to where the market might go from here, but as far as some of the experience, and when I saw solar going up on commercial roofs, it definitely had to do with when there was state money available to offset that.
I think that's your
investment
common
cost.
theme through all of your comments, that there needs to be grant funding. If there's gonna be a realistic.
Is it, if I may,
Yeah, sure.
is it the fact that you're incurring interest on the capital when you install it? That is what makes it not pencil out. So you said in your example, you said you would have to take on debt to put in the system. So in the two projects that I've been involved in, a nonprofit in my house, we also took on debt, but we had a federal tax break that covered that, and the other we had a grant that covered basically the cost of the debt. So I was just interested in your experience, that seems to be an important issue.
Yes, absolutely. And if you're looking at the cost of commercial debt today, and it's pushing 7%, if you look at, well, what's your cap rate or your return on your investment, when you're looking at offsetting the electrical cost, if let's take my office building with my 8 tenants and average approximate $1,000 a month, if we took that and then calculated that forward, we could put, time value of money on it and assess when does the system pay for itself. It's so far out, and then as interest rates continue to rise, it pushes that horizon even further out, that for an investment, for a building owner, they have to realize a return on that investment in less than 5 years. And so, and a building owner that's able to put money into a building and wait for a return on that investment, like let's say building out office for a large warehouse user. And so they give it a TI budget for that office. And so they're going to go spend $100,000 but they're getting $20,000 a month in rent. Well, looking forward, yeah, they're getting $20,000 a month in rent, but of that, how much is allocated for that office space? That's maybe only 10% of the warehouse. And what did that landlord have to extend to do that? Well, if that tenant has long enough term lease, if they're nationally rated, they're somewhat substantial, then a landlord potentially could have that risk to extend those dollars, knowing that they're not going to see the payback on that office portion for 5 years or longer. If you're talking about little, building owners in town, like guys like me, I need that return in 2 years. So if I go remodel an office for a tenant, like we just have some vacant office, what we had to spend on barely a 400 square foot office was tens of thousands of dollars. Paint, drywall, ceilings, new flooring. Flooring got really expensive, by the way. And so the cost now, looking at that, it's like, okay, well, the space rents for $800 a month. When am I going to realize my expenses back? And it's sort of a long time. It's not a very comfortable position to be in. So that's where it's for institutional investors. If you had REITs, or I'm trying to think of, there's a DST, which I'm not going to get into what that is, but just think REIT. But Phillips Edison that owns the property where Petco and Trader Joe's is located on South Commercial. The entity that owns that is very, very large. They have lots of those types of Class A retail investments around the Pacific Northwest. Somebody like that would have the capacity to do something. There needs to be a lot of available grant money for somebody small like me to be able to step in to do something. That's the reality.
That's extremely helpful.
Other conversations? Thanks, Commissioner Levin. We'll move on to information reports. We don't have any. Lisa, do you have a planning administrator's report?
I have no items to share.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 9, commissioners' comments for the good of the order, or just I have 2. Commissioner Slater and I thought it would be fun and meaningful to get us together outside of this chamber. So we're going to clean up one of the beds on the Peace Plaza, right outside the mayor's office on Earth Day, how appropriate, April 22nd at 11, and we'll get more details out to you. I do know that I'll be ordering Big Wig donuts as an enticement. And also a reminder, the state of the city is tomorrow, where we'll hear from Mayor Hoy on what's happening in the city and his vision moving forward. So other comments for the good of the order, Commissioner Ekus.
Last Friday, Salem City Club had a program with the city manager. And I thought I would point out that the city manager gave the planning division and Lisa by name, so high praise.
Well, there you go. You can go on your vacation in good conscience. Your job will be here when you get back. Other comments for the good of the order? Okay, we'll move on to item 10, public comment. We have Mr. Courtwright. If you could come up and state your name and address for the record. And you'll have 5 minutes once you kind of figure out that system up there and talk about your memo that we all received this afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair Griggs, Commissioners. My name is Bob Courtwright. I live in West Salem. I work with the 350 Salem org group, but I'm here just representing myself today. Hopefully I can get them involved in this as well. So what I want to talk to you about is the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules that LCDC has adopted and the city staff is working on. One of the key parts of that is designating what are called climate-friendly areas. And the city, in combination with COG, has just produced a study that estimates what the capacity of the areas that they think have potential for climate-friendly areas are. Let me just back up and focus on what the big picture here is for climate-friendly areas. The target that we're shooting for and the standard that we have to meet is to get 30% of the city's housing in these climate-friendly areas. That totals, according to the COGS estimates, about 26,000 units of housing. That's over the next, the total amount through 2035, 2040. The concern I have is that the analysis that the staff has presented dramatically overestimates the capacity of the 4 areas that they've identified as potential climate-friendly areas. The consequence of that, if we stick with the analysis they've done so far, is we're not going to designate enough area as climate-friendly areas to meet that 30% target. And what I'm asking you to do, or for the city to do, is to ask the staff to go back and review the study that's been done, and for staff to come up with a more realistic assessment of what the capacity of these areas are, and logically to go and look and identify other areas that have potential to be climate-friendly areas. You have in my written memo some of the analysis here, but I really want to emphasize how excessive and unrealistic the estimates are that have been prepared so far. And just to forgive the city a little bit, they're following the recommendations that the LCD provided in their rules. But those were untested, and we all, at least the advocates, have expressed concern about this from the beginning. But the estimates say that basically these areas, these 4 areas that include downtown, Lancaster, West Salem, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the 4th, Liberty and Commercial, I'm sorry, that those 4 areas could accommodate 55,000 units of housing. 55,000 units of housing. That's well in excess of what's needed. But currently, our adopted plans estimate, and this is out again through 2035, 2040, that those areas will have about 3,000 units of housing. That's 15 times as much housing as our current plans estimate will occur in those areas. It assumes a density of about 60 dwelling units per acre across each of those areas. That's pretty substantial. And basically assumes that we're going to not only develop the vacant land, but redevelop land that's already there to that kind of density. I think the other way to look at this is that meeting that 30% goal, again, getting 26,000 units of housing in climate-friendly areas would mean that we basically have to put all new housing that occurs in Salem in those climate-friendly areas. areas, to go from 3,000, which is what we're currently planning for, to 26,000. So I think that gives you a picture of, really, these are unrealistic estimates. The DLCD rule does allow the city to come up with its own method, an alternative method for calculating capacity. And actually, Thousand Friends and I wrote all of the cities that are responsible for doing this in January and said, hey, if you get unrealistic results, which we think you will, you should take advantage of this option to come up with, based on your plans and your local knowledge and experience, with a better estimate of what the real capacity of these areas are. And so that's really, to bring it full circle, where I think you ought to go from here is do a more realistic assessment of what you think the capacity of these areas are. And then based on other planning that you've done, identify other areas in the city that have potential to serve as climate-friendly areas. And I'm here today because there's a little bit of urgency to this. The deadline for getting the climate-friendly area study done is this December. Then based on that climate-friendly study, a year after that, and next year, 2024, the city has to designate climate-friendly areas. If we fall way short on that first step, which is what I think we're doing right now, we're going to be playing catch-up to accomplish and meet that goal. So I apologize that I've come to you quickly on this. I don't know how much background you have. I hope that made sense. I'd be happy to answer the questions you might have.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Courtwright? Or for Lisa? She's ready.
I have a couple questions, but I'm not sure who to direct it to, so I'll throw it out. What is the difference, I guess, what is the criteria for climate-friendly area? Is there, like, it has to be a certain size, it has to have certain infrastructure existing already?
It's not that it has to have certain infrastructure, it just have to be certain size. You can't pick corridors because they have to be 750 feet. So we fought against that in the rules. So for example, we can't designate State Street as a climate friendly area. It doesn't meet the criteria. That's just, they didn't want corridors, they want areas. And then there, like Bob says, there's a prescriptive way to calculate the housing. So I think DLCD's goal is that the zoning is a box that people can develop within, and they can develop really high density within there. Our zoning allows that. We were tracking this through our Salem, so we accommodated that generally in our zoning. At the last minute, they did change minimum density. So as Eunice and Julie presented last month, we'll fix minimum density. From our perspective, it's drawing a circle on a map for a climate friendly area because we picked North Downtown, and West Salem because it's already zoned for high density. It already meets the zoning except for the minimum density in our mixed use zones. And we're going to change that to meet the minimum density. So that will increase the minimum density. And we're going to apply it citywide. We rezoned like 2,000 acres to mixed use through our Salem. All of our corridors are mixed use. They already accommodate housing. The city set a goal, right? So I agree, the housing that the mathematical formula says could fit in there is not going to be built in downtown. But we followed the rules that the state has set out for designating an area. And we've done way more than that through our Salem by rezoning all kinds of areas for mixed use based on our core network and where we have transit.
Just later follow up.
So in listening to the two comments here, is the difference the question of corridors versus squares or polygons or whatever we want to call it? Is that the real difference between what's going on?
Maybe. I think what Bob is saying is he wants us to draw the circles and do the math and show a more realistic of what housing is going to be built. I guess from our perspective is we spent 4 years doing that work and adopted it through our Salem and have set goals for housing along the major transit network, downtown, et cetera. And the state's putting this extra requirement on us. The rules kind of assume a city has not zoned areas for high density mixed use, right? And so it's like pick an area and then zone it for mixed use, housing's permitted, maximum height of like 85 feet, minimum density, blah, blah, blah. We're like, yeah, done, all these places across the city. Once you designate a CFA, you know, make sure your zoning accommodates the housing, and then you have to plan for, you know, great ped bike infrastructure, change block length and that kind of stuff, which we're planning to do across the city with the TSP, right? So when Julie and Eunice were here saying, this is kind of the first phase of the TSP, which the council's asked us to get going on the transportation system plan, but we have this deadline for the CFA and the scenario planning at the state, which is kind of delaying our work on the transportation plan. So while the rules provide a prescriptive path, we don't see a benefit in it because it's more work to meet the state rules. Like they set out a very clear criteria. If you can do this math and show your zoning accommodates this housing, then you've met the rules. If you want to do something different, it's kind of nebulous about how you would get there, and it's a lot more work. And we already have rezoned all kinds of land across the city for high density mixed use along our major corridors. So we just don't see a benefit in doing more kind of mathematical work
Did you have a follow-up?
to get through this project.
Yeah.
It doesn't, you know, we have 2 long range planners, right? I mean, we have so much work we're doing, it just doesn't, we don't see a benefit in it.
I think Commissioner,
Commissioner thoughts? And then I will come back to you, Mr. Courtwright, to respond to his question.
Is this a question that's, it sounds like this is maybe a capacity versus expected development. And ultimately, we're required to provide 30% of the capacity provided, which is what's been done.
Right.
So it's not really, I mean, there's no way to predict really accurately how many real units of housing will be developed over the next 20 years. So
There's a lot of
if we're meeting
variables.
it as a percentage of potential capacity, and the R Salem project effectively designated many areas throughout the city as
Mixed use.
with the ability to be that's my understanding of what's happening. Is that correct? That's what I want to make sure of.
That is correct. In our Salem and the comp plan, we set a goal of a percentage of all new dwelling units within a core mile of the transit network in areas that's designated for mixed use. So downtown, river, the river area, and all our mixed use areas, our corridors. And in 2021, that was 34%. We set a goal for 2035 for that to be 35% of all, and that looks at existing, right? So like we set a more realistic goal in our Salem based on what we have and then what we were zoning for than what, you know, the Council of Government who did the, you know, formula for us for the CFA, the draft, what they're showing the capacity could be based on, you know, we fought back against the state. We were on the rulemaking committee, Julie and I. You know, the calculation is like 8-story buildings and 900, each unit's 900 square feet. And that seems ridiculous. And that's what they came up with. And, you know, we fought that battle and we lost that battle a year ago. We met with the state planners a lot. We got a lot of things to be different in the CFAC rules based on our relationship with the state and a lot of meetings they were willing to take with us outside of the rulemaking body. But this is a rule and we feel like we're complying with the rule. We've demonstrated there's more than enough capacity in the areas that we've picked. As Julie and Eunice said, we have to look at displacement. And so that's what we're focusing on instead of doing more of the math, you know, around the city. And actually tonight is the first equity roundtable meeting that Eunice talked about doing. So she's doing that right now at Center 50 Plus to focus on the displacement part of the project. That's where we feel like makes more sense to focus because we already did 4 years of scenario planning and rezoning and general outreach across the city through our Salem.
Mr. Courtwright, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
I certainly do. I think I stand by what I said.
Yeah.
The overall objective here, regardless of the method you use, is we want 30% of all housing, 26,000 units, to be in climate-friendly areas. I appreciate the work the city's done through our Salem and designated mixed use. Some of that I think has potential to be climate-friendly areas, but not all of it. mentioning that walking amount of development, the mixed use areas along the core transit network, those are within a quarter-mile distance as the crow flies. If you know Salem, you ate a crow. You got to walk from place to place. If we want really walkable, and again, the definition here is highly walkable mixed use areas where people are likely to get around without using a car. And those are not all of our mixed use areas have the potential to support that kind of development. Some do. And really that's what I'm saying is let's go to the next level. Let's make sure that the areas that we're identifying as climate friendly, that we have enough and that they meet the definition of a highly walkable kind of mixed use area. And one of the things that LCDC committed to, and actually they're getting underway now, is to make course corrections to the rules that they've adopted if they aren't working as intended, to make changes. And I will certainly be there reflecting the kind of concerns, and I think climate advocates as well to say, hey, this isn't coming out the way that you DLCD expected to. Again, this is a completely untried new method that they came up with that has this effect. But again, we should keep in mind what the objective here is, to get as much housing in those climate friendly areas as we can to meet that 30% target.
Thank you. And I think, the work through the R Salem was onerous, and I think they have come out with a, great proposition. My hope is then if the DLCD is going to be looking at adjustments, that we don't ask staff at this point to go back and recalculate, but I'm sure staff will respond if there are adjustments handed down from DLCD. I am kind of curious, but of course I'm just one person on this lovely commission. The other cities that you have reached out to, what has the response been? Are they going back to the table and redoing their plans?
Well, people are just coming out now with the kind of technical memos that we've received. I've looked carefully at the ones from Albany and Corvallis. They did a couple of different, they did a high and low estimate. So they did some adjustment to what they expected. I don't think they're as far off. I would say Corvallis had identified a number of areas that they felt had potential. So
and those entities too had done a similar R Salem work for the past 4 years.
Well, everybody in Oregon has done planning of some sort. Corvallis did a fair amount of work as part of their last regional transportation plan to look at land use changes. So they made a little bit more progress. I'm not as familiar with Albany.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ekus.
Thank you. I'm trying to frame this simplified manner so I can understand it. You're saying they estimate that they're overestimating and you want them to recalculate more realistically. If that recalculation ends up that they can't reach the 30% goal, does that mean identifying other areas?
Exactly.
And is that what you're basically talking about?
Yeah, again, if you look at your existing plans for these 4 areas that are studied, they say that 25 years from now, we'll have 3,100 units of housing in those 4 areas. And I'll wager that we put a lot of effort, and that reflects the implementation of our Salem as well, those estimates. So I think they were carefully developed. I think they're probably a realistic estimate. Do I think that we could do a lot better than that? Absolutely. Do I think we could do 15 times higher than that? I don't think that's a realistic estimate. So I think when you do a more realistic estimate that considers what you think is possible, and maybe it's doubling that 3,000 to 6,000 or something more than that, I think you're going to find there's still a gap and you need to look at other areas that have the potential to be CFOs.
Okay.
Do you have a follow-up? We good? Commissioner Slater.
Thank you. So I think I understand your position fairly well, Lisa. Is there a disadvantage to designating more space? I mean, does it create an obligation on us to take on additional expenses or work?
I don't know if there's a disadvantage. I mean, when Julie were here and they presented, you might remember that we said we're not going to call them climate friendly areas, we're going to call them walkable mixed use areas. And it's like, well, why are we giving you a different name? We don't want to draw a line on a map and say you're not in a climate friendly area, but you are. And it's because you live 3 blocks away, it's a corridor and it didn't, like people don't understand that, so we don't even wanna use that terminology. So that's part of it, right? Like it's just weird, and it's not like the zoning map is gonna show someone they're in a climate friendly area. It's gonna be a map that the city adopts as like a part of the comp plan, but like an attachment to the comp plan that this area, how we're adopting it is through the zoning, right? We're gonna submit to DLCD that the zoning meets what it needs to meet to be a climate friendly area. When we get into creating the TSB and updating it, then we do have to look at those areas, right, and make sure they're highly walkable. But the rules for doing a TSB have changed drastically with CFEC, these rules, so that prioritizing bike and ped across the city is now a requirement in every aspect of our planning and funding and projects we put in the TSB in ways that I'm not sure I completely understand. Julie's more the expert, and I'm not sure she completely understands until we get into it. It was a huge component of CFEC was to look at, transportation planning and how cities are prioritizing biking, walking, that kind of stuff. So I don't know if there's necessarily something negative. I mean, we could have left in the 2 other circles we put on there and said, hey, now there's 4 circles. We're not redoing them. I guess we don't see a benefit in redoing the map in a more realistic way. And also the city's not paying for this work. So DLCD is paying for the technical memos from the Council of Governments. So that was part of DLCD's budget when they adopted the climate friendly rules. They set aside money to this technical work for cities, and they paid the Council of Governments. And we have not paid them to take we're going on the rules. We're not going make up our own rules. I will say during the rulemaking, the perception I got as far as saying, oh, cities have another path was not necessarily, it's like if you want to try to get around, that's the way I've used it, it's very like you kind of calculate it this way, which some cities like, because then we don't get into a thing where people can challenge us on it, right? And it takes more time. But also there was a lot of complaints throughout the whole thing from cities saying like, you're telling us every little thing instead of big ideas, and it's too much. And so then they try to give these other, and they're like, fine, well, you can do your own thing. If you can do your own math, and you can show us, and it's like, okay, so there is another way. But it seems like a lot of work. I just strongly want to say I don't see a benefit in doing that work.
So
because I feel like we've done it.
Your view is that the R Salem project essentially met the spirit of what this is trying to accomplish.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Are there questions for Rob or for Lisa? Thank you for your time, Bob.
Thank you.
I said Rob, I meant Bob. Rob and a Bob tonight, that was it. Okay, with nothing else to do.